Hi, this week we're talking about family stories. And family stories can have kind of a broad definition. You can define them as stories that have been passed down in your family. These could be stories that your parents or your grandparents told you. They could be stories about your family or members of your family, or they could be stories that have no relation to your family at all, but that have been passed down in your family. Sometimes I just tell my children stories about me when I was a little kid. A lot of times the stories don't even have a point necessarily. It's not like there's a great moral to this story. They're just stories about me when I was growing up, and my kids love to hear those stories. Children love stories, and even if they don't have a great point, they care if they're stories about you because you're their parent. So a lot of times when we were traveling, and we traveled a lot in the car, they would say, tell me a story about when you were a little girl. So I would tell them stories about when I was little. I would tell them stories that I knew about my mother when she was little. I would tell them stories about my grandfather because my mother had told me stories about my grandmother and my grandfather. So really, there are so many stories that I could tell you today, but I've decided to tell you one about my grandfather. That's kind of a funny story. Now, my grandfather was born shortly before the Great Depression started, and he lived in a house with 12 brothers and sisters, including him. There were 12 children altogether, and his parents owned a farm, and this was out in West Texas. It was a dairy farm, so every day they milked a lot of cows, and from the time he was 3 or 4, as shortly after he was able to walk, he started working. And that's just how it was when you grew up in a farm family. And they did go to school when you got to about first grade age, but he only went to school through 6th grade. That was not uncommon then, to only go long enough to pretty much learn how to read and to do, math, subtraction and addition and decimals and fractions. But they didn't do a lot of algebra then, at least not for him. But he grew up way out in the country, and this was common. You had to work on the farm, and you had to work and help the family. Now, he was about 9 or 10 years old, and he had, remember, 12 brothers and sisters. So he had a whole group of brothers. I'm not even sure how many boys there were and girls. I think there were 7 or 8 boys and 4 or 5 girls. But one day, his dad had hired he and his brothers out to another farmer who lived not too far away. And this farmer had grown a large field of watermelons. What the farmer wanted the boys to do was cut the watermelons off the vine and load them into large wagons, and then he was going to take them to market to sell. And he told them that you can eat as much watermelon as you want, and they were going to take a wagon load of watermelons themselves to take home so that they could keep them, and put them in their storehouse and bottle them or whatever it was they did to keep watermelon fresh back then. But he said, so in return, they could eat as much watermelon as they wanted while they were cutting them, and they could take a whole load of watermelon back home with them. So they were out there in this big field cutting watermelons pretty much all day. Now, their dad was not there that day to supervise because he was on another farm doing some other work. So it was just the boys out there by themselves. Now, they had these very large knives that were, long machete type knives. I probably can't even show you how wide they were here on the screen, but they were very large machete type knives, very sharp, because watermelon vines are pretty thick. So with one chop of the knife, they could sever that very thick vine and pull the watermelon off. And also the machete was very handy for chopping the watermelon open. So they all had these very sharp knives for cutting these watermelons with. Now, as the day went on, they worked hard and they were eating watermelon, as they went. And there was so much watermelon, and the farmer knew that, they weren't going to stay good forever. So like he said, eat as much as you want while you're cutting. So they would cut the watermelons open, and they would eat the center of the watermelon, which is the sweetest part of the watermelon. And so as the day was going on, they were eating watermelon, acting like boys, getting sillier by the minute. So they started having a bit of a watermelon fight, throwing watermelon back and forth at each other. And finally, one of the older brothers put a big chunk of watermelon. He had hollowed out a watermelon and put a chunk of watermelon on another brother's head. Well, the brother who the watermelon on the head wasn't very happy, and he told his brother, he threw the watermelon off, and he said, if you throw one more piece of watermelon at me, I'm going to cut your nose off. And he had his knife that he was holding up, and of course they all thought he was kidding, so the brother threw another piece of watermelon at him, and the one with the knife took the knife and reared back and chopped at his brother, and sure enough, he cut his nose right off, right here, chopped it. It was just barely hanging by the bottom, and of course blood was squirting everywhere. Now they were probably a mile from home. They had some rags, so of course the brother who had chopped thought, he said, that the other brother would, back up, but the other brother didn't back up when he chopped, so he did cut his nose right off. So they got the nose and tried to stick it on as best they could and hold it on with rags while they ran the brother home to their mama, because this was out in the country and there wasn't a doctor anywhere near, and none of them ever went to the doctor when they were sick anyway. Pretty much mama took care of everything. I feel sorry for their mother, by the way. But, so they ran this poor boy home, crying and bleeding all over the place, to mother, and this was my great-grandmother. And so she sat him down and got out the turpentine. This must have hurt like crazy, and washed the whole area with turpentine to basically sterilize it. She knew that it needed to be clean. So she cleaned it really good, and she stuck that nose back on, and then she sewed right around the nose with some strong sewing thread that she had. She put a little glue in there too. So between the glue and the thread, she sewed the boy's nose back on him. His nose was fine. It all grew together, and he did end up having a scar. But later in life, he became a pro golfer and was very successful and lived a very long, happy life, and his sinuses never bothered him a bit. I thought it was amazing, and I can only be thankful that I don't have a watermelon patch to send my children to. So beware. Okay, can't wait to hear your family story. Any family story will do. Thanks, bye.